Dear God in heaven, we thank you for the privilege of being able to come before you on this, your Sabbath day. We ask for a special blessing as we are going through these topics that are so important at this point in time. Where we are in history is just, it's almost difficult to believe this is where we're at, even though we've been looking for this time for a long time. I just pray now that as I'm presenting that it will be clear and that it will somehow prove a blessing to those who hear. And I just thank you again for all your blessings in Jesus' name. Amen. So this morning, my topic is sort of complementary to what Takasa shared this morning, which is sometimes the case when it's not the same, but it's definitely along some similar lines. And what I'm talking about today, I've called it identifying the National Sunday Law through understanding the test. So what I'm going to be doing isn't reviewing one specific presentation. I'm actually pulling things from a lot of different presentations over the years, and I'm also it's kind of going to be a little bit like a flyover. So a lot of what I'm going to share, especially to start with, will be stuff that everybody is already very familiar with, which means that I should be able to go over those points quite quickly. Obviously, if there's any confusion or if I haven't explained something that needs to be explained, feel free to interrupt me at any point. That's perfectly fine. And so basically, as we all know, I'll just share my notes here, if I may. Let me just... And see if I can find this. I wonder if that's going to work. Yes, it is. That's good. Okay, so can everybody see my notes there, hopefully?
Yes, clear.
Thank you. So we're starting with the reform lines because that's kind of where we always need to start in a way. Well, for a lot of things. So we're mostly going to be looking at the line of the 144,000. But now you can all still see my board, I'm assuming. You can't see my other notes, hopefully. I think it's just perfect. That's good. I just thought I'd double check. Yeah, so basically we wanted to just start with the things that are really basic. So we've identified 4 main reform lines for quite some time. So our main reform line, as everybody knows, is the 144,000 line. And we had 3 other lines that were fractals of that line. The first being the priests, and of course then we had the Levites and then the Nethinim. Basically, the reason I've just put the priests there is because the first 2 waymarks of both of those lines were the same. So they were sharing the same experience right up until they were sharing the same experience until we finished the priests line. But of course, they're sharing the same first 2 waymarks without any changes. And of course, all the events that were happening to us as a movement and as individuals throughout this period, it was happening on the line of the 144,000 as well, except for the fact that we weren't really travelling on that line until after the priests line finished. There was relevant information that we were given that would help us for when we were just on the 144,000 line. But in order to understand events, we were given this pattern. And a part of that pattern was to establish some minor waymarks. We had the 5 major waymarks, obviously time of the end, 2001, Sunday law, close of probation, and then the second advent. And then we fairly early in the piece, as in quite a long while ago is probably more the point, it was identified an increase of knowledge and formalisation, and these were 2 waymarks or minor waymarks that appeared in between the major waymarks, and it also formed a pattern that we could recognise, which helped us to identify where we were on the line. It helps us to understand the process that we're going through, and Elder Tess expanded on that just not long after the midnight cry was given, where she basically talked about Boston, Concord, Exeter, and Test. And this was done obviously by the names when doing a comparison with the Millerite time period. What we came to understand about these points is that Boston represented the arrival of a message. Concord was the increase of knowledge, where the message that had arrived, we received an increase of understanding and knowledge about that message. And then, of course, the formalisation, the message was maturing, and then it was formalised so that we were then ready for the test. And the test, even though we mark the test at the next Boston, the test really starts in a way at that formalisation and continues through. But the test at the next major waymark marks where that test is finalised. It was spoken about like that's where you received your mark. And I guess you had to be able to recognise something at that point that related to the message that had arrived back at Boston. So just looking where I'm up to. So I've just illustrated that there. You can see where this is a repeating pattern through all the dispensations, because we had the 5 major waymarks, and then we had the in between was a time period which we refer to as a dispensation, and we see that repeating pattern. So the dates that occurred, as I said, on the priest line, even though they don't appear as either a major waymark or even a minor waymark, they were still relevant to helping us to understand where we were when we were on that major, on the main line, on the main 144,000 line. So just to I've just made a little note here, and I'm not 100% sure about where the angels arrive and are empowered. However, I remember at one point, and I probably need to go back and study this particular point out even further, but to review it again to see where we ended up, because it's hard to remember sometimes where we start and where we end up, because we often will develop and change our understanding of certain things. But the first angel arrived in 1989. I think that's all very set. And then we had the empowerment of that angel at 9/11, and the second angel arrived. It's possible that the third angel also arrived there. So that's where my discrepancy comes in. So I apologise for if anyone does have any clearer view on that, please feel free to interrupt, but it won't change the point that I wanted to make. And the main point I wanted to make is actually this part here. These were extremely important points for us to understand in order for us to move forward on the line of the 144,000 and become a line of success. And so parable method, well, first the reform lines and then parable methodology. Obviously, they contain a lot of information other than just those statements. So I wanted to just take a very quick look at some parabolic models, and the first one was the agricultural model, which again I know we're all familiar with, and that is the time of the end. We have the ploughing starts in this period of time. We have, no, let's do that. So we have the ploughing, and then we have the sowing of the seed here at 9/11. Then during this period here, it's the early and the former rain, and it's a period of growth. Starts here, obviously, and you'll see the seeds gradually grow, fruit starts to come, and then we pass the Sunday law, we have the latter rain, and of course, from the close of probation, we have the harvest. The other brief overview is the 7 steps of salvation. So this is a very busy time because it's conviction, repentance, confession, and conversion all occur in this period of time. We have at 9/11, we have baptism, and this also is justification. And that's from that moment, we start with a process of sanctification. Now, we're looking at this in a prophetic sense. It's not like everybody had to be baptized then. This is actually a prophetic model, parabolic model even, where we are able to see the process, and on a personal level, we may experience the same order of events. It just doesn't have to be tied to the timeline in the same way. So the process of sanctification, and then, of course, we have glorification at the end. And that process of sanctification is the work of a lifetime. So I wanted to have a look at those models combined, but for the period of time which is our previous dispensation. So we're going from 9/11 to Sunday law, and we want to try to just be a bit more clear about what the Sunday law looks like. Now, I'm not talking about the Sunday law, that period that goes from the start through to the close of probation, and like from the national Sunday law to the worldwide Sunday law. I'm actually just talking about identifying the point where that starts. And we know that that's going to be a test, and it has to be, by definition, a test on the messages that we've received prior to that time. And because it's all about this dispensation. But at the same time, when we combine those two parables, we can see that we have a period of sanctification combined with that period of growth, which is really very consistent. You can see how they do work together. This is a really easy question. If someone wants to answer me, what is the rain? I know you all know. Can someone tell me what is the rain that's falling here in the early or former rain, and also later on in the latter rain? But would someone like to tell me? Yeah, exactly. It's the messages. So we've got the angels who are bringing the messages to God's people, and the rain is the messages that is causing this sanctification and growth. And we've had a long time, really, from 2001. It's at least 23 years since then that we've been receiving an outpouring of this early rain and the messages that God wants his people to, or their people, to understand in order for them to be able to grow. And of course, that means to also bring them out of Laodicean condition as well, because that's where we were coming from. So the rain is definitely the messages. And the other thing that I want to look at very briefly now is that we recognise to some degree 2001 and 2014 were like harbingers for the National Sunday Law. I'd suggest they're actually for both the National Sunday Law and the Worldwide Sunday Law, but we're specifically looking at the national for this particular study. And these 2 points should be giving us characteristics of what that National Sunday Law is. Now, we know that we had to look back because we didn't recognise 2014 when we were there. It's something at the time, as a movement, the leadership had rejected Elder Parminder's prediction in 2012 of the Sunday Law occurring in 2014, and consequently he was silenced for a period of time, and the message did not get out to the movement as a whole. So most of us, the majority by far, were not aware of that message, and it was only much later we were able to look back. It was then confirmed, and the understanding of why that was a Sunday law was given to us. So we were able to then look at it and see it in the context of the midnight cry and the messages that were given to us then, and especially the light that brought to us that the Sunday law was not what we'd always thought. It wasn't going to be a Sunday law, right, as was just brought out in the previous study from Takasa. So we understood it quite differently, and we had to go back. And when we went back to look, we could actually see that in 2014, the who, I've put who, was the Republican Party, and the what were the topics, gender equality, sexism, and human rights. And when we look back at 2001, again, at the time, we didn't know where we would be now. We didn't know what the topics were, and we were very much in our older mindset of conservative Adventism and Protestantism, even, if you like. We had very conservative and very black and white views. Thus saith the Lord, as an example, was one of our often repeated phrases, which we came to understand quite differently as well over time. So in 2001, we marked 9/11, but we know that the whole year is also relevant, and also 11/9 for that year was significant, and Elder Tess brought that out later on as well. So Elder Tess did a study and where she brought up, looking back at a whole lot of events that had occurred during the 2014 time period. And just here, I haven't listed them all. She had like over 26, I think. But what I've listed here, I've picked out the ones that were relevant to the US primarily. In other words, I looked at it like these were the ones relevant for the National Sunday Law, because the National Sunday Law is in the United States. And then the others, even though they're relevant, I felt that perhaps they had more relevance to the Worldwide Sunday Law. They were all very similar, and you could categorise them the same. But due to room and the fact that we're looking at the National Sunday Law, I just included these ones here. And I divided them up into the reinvention of the Republican Party and also gender equality and human rights, which we know is our test. And you can see there's so much. And we had no idea about this at the time. So looking back, we can see all these things. We can see how when they were trying to rebuild the Republican Party, and they had a long-term plan in mind. They knew where they were going, and they've been very meticulous at carrying out their plan, and it's been very successful for them. So they first of all purged them of moderates. They blocked judicial appointments. You had Cambridge Analytica that interfered with or provided information with the election in 2016. You had the Russian hacking with the State Department. It was Russian hacking the US State Department is what I'm trying to say. Then you had the Internet Research Agency, Russian Internet Research Agency. There was Afghanistan's final phase where the US war was sort of drawing to a close, even though it took them a while to, a good while to actually finish it up. You had the caliphate for ISIS caliphate, which prompted airstrikes of Iraq and Syria by the USA. And of course, they had Steve Bannon, who was expounding his worldview at the time. And of course, then with the subjects to do with equality and human rights, we have the Hobby Lobby with the Supreme Court, with birth control and religious freedom. The turning point for climate change, there was basically an important point, understanding and knowledge as far as what the impact of climate change was or would be. Gamergate, culture, sexism and violence assisted by the far right. Basically, assisted the far right. That Gamergate actually assisted the worldview of the far right, is what I was trying to say. So things like gender discrimination, harassment, retaliation, unequal pay, and the League of Legends is an example of a game that was actually sued by female employees for 100 million, and they won for all of these points. These were the points that they sued about. They weren't being paid the same as the males, and they ended up winning that court case. Flint water crisis, you have the mobilisation of the incels, gay marriage turning point. Elder Tess pointed out that it didn't really happen until 2015, but the topic was really agitated starting from 2013. And again, it was another turning point in 2014 where it was start to be seen as to be accepted, and it was ending up being passed in 2015. You had the HERO Act, which was Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, which was basically a culture war over trans. And then the South Baptist resolution, biological sex alone was acceptable, male, female, that was it. And of course, these were all external events, and these were things that we needed to be able to see but couldn't recognise because we had no knowledge of what we were looking for at the time. And at the same time, looking back, we can also see internal events where the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Spectrum magazine were talking about in 2014 and 15 there was a lot of discussion around transgender. There was position statements, and of course Ben Carson was starting to run as a potential presidential candidate, and he made this a talking point. And there were articles put out, as well as a film project that they did, all to do with that Seventh-day Adventist Church. And then, of course, October 2014, the Biblical Research Ethics Committee issued a statement on transgenderism. And so it had really become a major issue. And the guidelines adopted by the church leadership in 2014 state, and I'll just read it, even I'm not sure how easy people can read my messy printing, but I'll read it. It is inconsistent with the Adventist Church's understanding of scriptural teaching to admit into or maintain membership of persons practicing sexual behaviours incompatible with biblical teaching. Neither is it acceptable for Adventist pastors or churches to provide wedding services or facilities for same-sex couples. This really could have been written by any of the far-right Christian conservatives that exist today, and what we see happening in the United States, which I think is really interesting. They had exactly the same, or they have exactly the same stand on these issues. So in October of 2014, the General Conference agreed to consider women's organisation, even though they did decide against it. They decided to reject it, not surprisingly. But as I mentioned, the movement didn't recognise any of these things as for the significance that they were. So if anyone's having any trouble following me, please let me know, and I can repeat something or answer any questions. So with all of these things in mind, I wanted to go back and take a closer look at 2001 in particular, because Elder Tess had gone through and had a closer look at 2014. So just to start with, I want to ask some questions about 2001. Can anyone tell me, just at the time, what were our observations at the time? Not without the knowledge that we have now. What did we see at that time? Can anyone give me some suggestions, please?
The rise of radical Islam, third wave.
Yeah, okay. I'll put that one here only because I had something else before that and I'm just keeping it in order, but it's then none are more important than the other. So the third woe, the rise of Islam. Anyone else? It's related to that.
I think I
Sorry?
remember. Sorry, I was only about 11 years old at the time, but I remember my dad, of course, um,
Yep.
having discussions about, the American government's response to 9/11, sort of, and the sort of fear around the laws that they brought in to arrest people without charge and things. And they're talking about, oh, this is bad news for this, who are heading for Sunday law sort of thing, and that sort of panic around that.
Yeah.
So even though we're on the other side, there was still a recognition, I guess, that it was pointing to Sunday law topics.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's actually a good point. And yes, I think that especially for Seventh-day Adventists who were conservative and very much looking for the Sunday law, this sort of an event would be something that would trigger that for sure. So how would I write that? You were saying basically pointing to the Sunday law. Would that work?
Yeah, just, I don't know, concerning legal developments, maybe.
Okay. Concerning legal developments. Okay. Let me just see. That's bought. How's that? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Perfect. Okay. So there's one that's really obvious, which is related to this second one. And that is, and I will just put that here primarily because I think it's relevant as I'm moving through the study. And that is, what we saw was a terrorist attack, right? We know it was Islam, and we know that we saw it as the third woe. And it did lead to the restraint of Islam as a result of those. So those two are very closely related. Let me ask a question about, does anyone remember, and Ray may not, given, and anyone else around a similar age may not, does anyone remember what sort of things the movement made of this? So you might remember because they were still talking about it in, 2008 to 2010 and all of that. What did the movement at the time interpret the three planes as? Does anyone remember that? That's fine if
It
you
was
don't.
one into the wealth,
Ah,
one into the land or the earth,
right.
and one into the Pentagon, which was the law or something.
Okay. Yep. Very good. Is that what you were going to say, Josephine?
No, Lynn, maybe I'm off the track, but what I was
No,
going to
you might not
say
be.
is I think there was some connection to, it may not be the movement's thoughts at that time, connection to what Sister White wrote and the book
Ah,
of somebody.
yes,
Yeah, you know what I mean.
I do. I do. And yes, we did.
End times
We took it as a literal fulfillment of what
event, yes.
Ellen White described when she saw what was happening in New York City, right? That's what you're referring
Yes.
to?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
what I was referring to.
Yeah, absolutely. And we did take that as being, because, on a quick reading, it kind of appealed to our literal way of thinking and seeing things, I guess. We came to understand it a bit differently later on, of course, but that's what we came to understand, that she wasn't referring to that time period. She was talking about, I believe, either the Sunday law or after, or maybe even later. It wasn't for that time period we came to see. So I'll just put government. I should have put law because that would have been a smaller word, and then into the earth. Now,
Lynn, I have a
can I?
question about
Yes.
that.
Oh, good.
That passage of of Ellen White that referred to, I think it was like 9T page 11 or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's making me wonder, did it appeal to an element of superstition in our methodology, that just those numbers lined up and is that something we had to step away from, that the Midnight Cry really brought us away from?
I think that's actually true in a sense, because I think it was involved with because our view was simplistic, and I'll use that word because I think we did have a simplistic view. We held to a lot of the traditional conservative Seventh-day Adventist views on what was happening at the end, and we were always looking for literal fulfillment. So, but it also, I think, did appeal to the sense of conspiracy theory type stuff. I mean, whatever that is, it's a human condition, I guess, where we look for coincidences, that, we're looking for patterns, we're looking for reinforcement of views that we already have, and we're looking for things that confirm what we already believe. And it's interesting that those things were able to be seen, even though it wasn't really where we were headed. But maybe it served a purpose to highlight some of the things we needed to work on, which we came to understand later, but not at the time. So thank you for bringing that point up. I think that's a very valid point as well.
I agree with the explanation you just gave, Lynn. I totally agree. I don't think we were, as a movement, were superstitious. Sorry, Ray, you're my friend. You forgive me. But coincidentally, it was in the 9, the paragraph, the chapter. So it was easy because we hadn't. There's not this increase in knowledge yet, so it's a start. But that's how the message develops when we actually examine it more carefully.
Yes. No, I think, I think I agree with what you're saying. I don't think we would have described ourselves or saw ourselves as being superstitious. However, when we look back, I can understand why Ray used that word, because it's fairly closely aligned when you start looking for signs and symbols that are literal, that you sort of then turn into like numbers and this does that. And you know, there may even be some things there that are true. However, they don't really give you any meat or substantial information, especially as we were moving forward and starting to understand a bit more the complicated play of human events. It was way too simplistic, I think, and certainly appealed to probably the same parts of our thinking that could be taken away with superstition, put it that way. So I think, you know, both views have merit, I think, in that regard. But thank you for that comment, Josephine and Ray.
To Lynne,
Mhm.
like Jesus, the wise men following the star was a token. And I think everything you say is correct. But I also think that maybe they were there just as a token to strengthen our faith. And there
Yeah.
was there was a lot of 11/9s and 9/11s and different studies.
Yeah, no, I agree. I actually, I think that's a good point. God knew where we were at, so maybe God allowed certain things to be there to encourage us at the time, because God was trying to lead us through a process in order to get closer to where they want us to be. Yeah, so I think that's a really good point too. Thank you for sharing that, Marie.
Sure.
There's one other thing that I have written down, which was, does anyone remember what we saw or we marked at 9/11 with regards to the Seventh-day Adventist organisation? Does anyone remember that? And it's fine if you don't. We marked the apostasy of that organisation because they adopted something called spiritual formation. Does anyone remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, and that was something that they were talking about, how it had come from the Jesuits, Ignatius Loyola, and was based on spiritual exercises from him. So we then determined, well, they'd completely fallen, so it marked the apostasy of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So that's how we saw it, right? And I've just written here, which I've kind of already mentioned, the fact that Boston, your message arrives, you have an increase of knowledge at Concord, and Exeter is going to be formalised, the message that arrived. And then, of course, you have the test, which we went through before. Now, the other thing that was important was the fact that you've got points that are internal and external. Now, what we've just gone through were the perceptions we had at the time, right? So now what I'm going to look at is some of the things that we've seen since then. And obviously we know that we had the 2014 Sunday law, but we didn't see that till later. It was almost like we didn't really get improved understanding on that until Elder Tess was able to look back and show us how it connected with the messages that she was given to share with us. So we had the midnight cry, and then we had we really started to receive a lot of information that required us to unlearn a lot of things and learn new things. So the first things I wanted to point out on that line, even though I haven't got the line there, but you know that 2019, we recognised on the 144,000 line, it was a point on the priest line as well, and it was related, but that was on the 144,000 line. Concord externally, we recognised was the first impeachment of Trump with the inquiry on the 24th of September and 2019, and he was then impeached on the 18th of December of 2019. So that was the external points that we mark as Concord on that 144,000 line. And then internally, we recognise the introduction of feminism and wearing pants as a symbol. That was a huge transition for us as conservative Seventh-day Adventists to make. Even though we were going to make even bigger ones, this was the first important, well, everything was important, but this was something that stood out as something that was, very critical to us moving forward, and we didn't even realise then just how critical. So that was when that was all Concord externally and internally. And of course, then Exeter on the 144,000 line is external again and internal. So for the external, it was January 6th, the insurrection by MAGA with encouragement, that should be, not encouraged, but anyway, encouraged by Trump, basically. Encouragement from Trump to storm the Capitol. And that was a significant event. And then internally, we had the introduction of radical feminism, and that expanded our whole perspective on what feminism encompassed. We started to appreciate minority groups and the importance of accepting individuals and understanding the fact that sin, when you're born a certain way, that and it can't be a sin, basically. That was all parcel of that. There's a whole lot more to it, obviously, but just very important messages for us going forward, especially as we were coming up closer to the Sunday Law waymark. So we've also come to see since that, I'll just back up a tiny bit. We also understood that as radical feminists, we were trans-inclusive radical feminists. We weren't part of those. There were many brands, there were a few different brands of feminism, and radical feminism was the closest to what we could see, which was accepting minority groups, accepting individuals for who they were, and we recognised science as being important and relevant to us understanding human beings, our fellow humans. So I just want to very briefly, again, you can see really touching on a whole lot of points here. Elder Tess talked about the line of restoration. Now, all these things were really bringing us to a point where we could understand and recognise what the Sunday Law was about, and also going forward, what things like things that have been brought up in other studies, like the image of the beast, like National Sunday Law, Worldwide Sunday Law, close of probation, going forward, understanding the issues that we're really being tested on. And we saw in this line of restoration how there was a chiastic structure where we had to work our way back through the issues, the three first main issues, and most, I suppose, injustice in humanity could really be traced back to these three things. So things like slavery, we obviously came to understand that at some point, that was wrong. Worship, on how not just the Sabbath, but how to worship and what that meant. And then that really, these two were understood in Millerite's time. And now we come to, and to a point they should have understood, but they didn't, was human rights, which is, I've added that to this because we've come to understand through Elder Parminder's studies how true feminism really incorporates equality for all and equity, and it encompasses human rights, inequitable human rights. So this is really where we're at now, and we need to pass these tests. Now, we would never have been able to do this back in 2001 because we had no knowledge, and God couldn't give it to us all at once. It had to be a process. And we saw that modern Israel, the alpha of modern Israel, the Millerites, was a line of failure. And of course, modern Israel, the 144,000, the Omega, is a line of success. And the Millerites didn't understand what they thought was the Sunday law and a Sabbath issue as a test. They had missed things like external events. They didn't fully understand how the Sabbath and humanity were connected, understanding what the importance of the last 6 commandments are for us to understand, and the connection that we can't really serve God if we can't serve our fellow humans. So they didn't really understand the issue of human rights. They did pass the slavery test to a degree, even though they didn't connect it to the importance of the tests. They also passed the worship test to the degree that they realised the Sabbath was still applicable. They didn't necessarily, again, connect it to the human aspects of that and the human right aspects. And Elder Parminder has told us that when we look back and we study what was going on around those times, we can see that the issues really were the same sort of issues as we have now, human rights issues, but they were a line of failure. So they didn't see the intricacies, they didn't recognise external events, and they didn't understand the other deeper, more complicated messages that they were meant perhaps to understand. But we can understand now, looking back, we have an advantage because we can see what they went through, and this helps us to have really no excuse for where we are today and being able to understand these things better and in this line of success. So it's up to us to, as I mentioned here, to pass this last great test, and because we're the ones who are on that line of success. So the Millerites had misunderstandings. They didn't understand external events. They were very much caught up with the Sunday law and the papacy. We've actually come to understand other things like human rights. We've got a new view of what the threefold union looks like. So another rule that we've got is that we can look at the beginning to get a better idea of the end. So we know the end from the beginning. So it's also logical that if there's a Concord and an Exeter, then there has to be a Boston, right? So this, again, takes us back to 2001. And Elder Terry did actually do this for us to a degree, a large extent. And it was quite a significant event, although at the time, I don't think we all realised until after. And that was when we had the Australian camp meeting in October of 2023, and Elder Terry presented on October 7. And as it turned out, at that point in time, it was literally the invasion of the kibbutz by Hamas in Israel, on the edge of Israel. And it was pretty much the start, well, not pretty much, it was the start of the ethnic cleansing and the genocide that we're viewing now with what's going on and what's been happening ever since. So it was a significant event for sure. And Elder Terry brought a couple of books to us. One was this one called The Demon Lover by Robin Morgan. And as I've written here, it was first published in 1989 under the title, The Demon Lover on the Sexuality of Terrorism. So it was a feminist, Robin Morgan's a feminist scholar, I believe, and she was pointing out the connection between sexuality and terrorism. It went out of print during the 1989, and by 2001, after the event of 9/11, it was realised just how relevant that book was to what had just happened. So they decided to reprint it. So it ended up being printed in 1989 and in 2001, which is extremely relevant from the movement's perspective, and the topics that we understand are so important. And this time it was actually titled, they changed the subtitle, The Demon Lover, The Roots of Terrorism. And this was the cover. It's definitely worth getting if you can find it and having a read. I did find a PDF version online, I think, as well. So I just wanted to point out a couple of things from this book that was highlighted in this review, or an analysis of this. And it's basically saying it's an in-depth feminist analysis of violence, which was updated for a 9/11 for after 9/11, basically, for a world that exists after 9/11. So very relevant for the dispensation we're studying, right? So I'll just read a couple of the bits I've highlighted. And I can, if anyone wants my notes, I can certainly give you my notes after, and you can certainly read the rest of it. Viewing the problem as eroticization of violence, the sexual charisma that violence has come to exude. And then terrorist acts, just moving down to here, terrorist acts are overwhelmingly committed by men, and Morgan locates those acts on a continuum of violence that is now so normal as to be deemed simply manhood. Here for the first time, and I thought this was very interesting, here for the first time, Palestinian women speak movingly of their struggle to survive as women through extraordinary interviews Morgan conducted in refugee camps. So there were refugee camps from the 1940s in Palestine. Of course, what we've seen now is just the complete demolition of the Gaza Strip. And it's actually really terrible to see, but to think that this was even mentioned specifically here, and it's also really relevant in the world we're living in today at this time. So a final chapter titled Beyond Terror sets the compelling vision of hope for the future, in which the patriarchal thirst for death is slaked and a new politics of eros blooms. So I found that a bit sad, because with what we see moving forward, we can't see this outcome for this world. And it's unfortunately, even though there was progress being made for a period of time, there's been a big backward or downturn on progress as far as these things are concerned. And you only have to look at Gaza and the Palestinian women and and all the children and what's happening there. And really, it's terrorism. The whole thing is terrorism. It's all part and parcel. So there's a distinct connection between terrorism and patriarchy, this apis bull culture that we've studied. And just as I did an AI condensed summary of the book, it says that Morgan maintains that the terrorist has been the ultimate male sexual idol of a male-centered cultural tradition dating from biblical times. In this study, she critiques the modern terrorist mystique, centering the problem in the sexual charisma violence commands in our society. So again, I've just noted the fact that this book was published first in 1989 and again in 2001. And we can see the culture that she's describing. Well, we can certainly see it in MAGA. I think we can see it in the world we're living in. And two of the things that I found that I'm sure you're all aware of, was gaming culture and dark romance. Dark romance, for anyone who doesn't know, is a genre of romanticism, romantic novels, stories, whatever it might be, where there's dominant males who are often violent and they control submissive females, basically. Women have a role and the males dominate that. Now, the second book Elder Terry shared was September 11, 2001, Feminist Perspectives. So basically, I'm not going to read all of this. I'm just going to really touch on the headings, really. The book was a compilation of different authors who had written either papers or articles that were relevant. And so it was a compilation of those multiple authors. It covered these topics, though, these themes: intersections of violence and oppression, giving a voice to women, critique of global politics, the roots of terrorism, the impact on the Middle East, feminist ethics in peace building, gendered and racial discourses. So all of these topics in 2001 were not on our radar. Feminism, sexism, patriarchy, even equality, they weren't really on our radar. And Elder Terry made the following statement. I made a note of this at the meeting, and I don't think that meeting, the original meeting, was recorded either. So it was just my notes I could go on. And Elder Terry said, these women were voicing something and they have not been listened to. These were just points. Widespread resistance to the masculinist politics of war. The terror war, hyperbolic machismo, which hyperbolic is just like hyperbole. It's exaggerated, for want of a better word. Machismo, aggressive masculine pride. And the book explained how terrorism is the ultimate end of patriarchy. And that's, I think we can all relate that to what we see going on in the world today with what's happening in America, but also the world. And we can see how even on a domestic level, domestic violence is terrorism in the home. In America now, when you've got ICE agents roaming streets and picking people off streets or from workplaces, this is all really terrorism. It's all being run by a terrorist mentality and this machismo mentality. So I haven't got a long way to go. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. So looking further into 2001, the impact of 9/11, the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and the subsequent war on Afghanistan had a significant impact on women's rights and discussions, and created a context where groups like RAWA were prompted to take action, and that's the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan. Well, we can see that's all just gone downhill really badly in those countries around there. So key themes in the US around the early 2000s, key issues, key themes that were all relevant were things like reproductive rights, combating sexual violence, and workplace equity. You can see how all these things have continued to be issues ever since. At first looking to improve and now kind of on the decline again. Specific campaigns that were mentioned for 2001 is Gather the Women. The organisation was active in 2001, and participating in feminist-related initiatives during that year. So, United States human rights concerns, I've underlined them there, but they're listed here as well. So I'm not going to read the details, but just the headings. These were issues in 2001. And it's interesting looking back, we can see how relevant it is to us now. Racial discrimination, police and prison misconduct, use of restraint devices, treatment of minors and detainees, inhumane treatment in immigration detention. How relevant are these things in the US now? The impact of the September 11 attacks. It says here, while it's not just domestic human rights that were immediately affected, but the war on terror had a significant impact on human rights in the US and internationally. So these attacks led to increased security measures and a broader debate on the balance between national security and individual freedoms. Now, for those of us who recognise that our freedom isn't important as the equality of others, we could understand why these things had to be in place. But for those who were very focused on their own personal freedoms, these could breed or increase the discontent, I guess you could say. So human rights reporting, UN Committee Against Torture, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, specific events, the HRW, which we've just mentioned here, reported on the US stance on anti-personal mines and inhumane treatment of prisoners. So again, it's all, I find, very relevant to where we are at the moment. So this brings us to this question mark, right? We've all started to form thoughts about what we feel represents this mark, but I think when we look at all of this information and we understand this test has to be related to this, it has to be related to this and to this. The topics that were discussed, the messages that were given, the early rain was preparing us to recognise and accept a point. Even though the Sunday law is a period of time that goes on, there's a point, it starts. And we needed to recognise that to be able to understand it better and to be able to see why we'd been given all this information. So radical feminism, the root of feminism, equality and human rights, gender equality, the root of terrorism, patriarchy, my freedom over your equality, the use of force. So I thought it was interesting to see that we saw that radical feminism, radical meaning root, and then we saw that the root of terrorism is patriarchy. I just thought they were an interesting compare and contrast, I suppose. So the conclusion of the test for this dispensation has to be about these topics, which I've just said. And all the Sunday law speakers, I just want to stress, have valid studies, I believe. And we need to look at them further and study them more, because I don't think, as I think Elder Parminder's been bringing out, at least this is what I've taken away, I suppose I should say, that these studies don't just represent necessarily a Sunday law mark. They actually represent potentially as information that could be related to a new message for the dispensation going forward. So when I understood that, I thought, okay, I need to look at those studies in a different light. Instead of looking at them to try to work out what Sunday law is, I need to look at them and see what the relevance might be to the present dispensation. However, for this study, I believe that despite the relevance or the validity of all the studies, I think Elder Terry's studies best relate to the topics that we've just been going through and really give us a point where we can recognise the start of that Sunday law. So obviously I'm presenting something that are my thoughts to a point, and why I think this way. The topics that Elder Tess listed in 2014, I mentioned this before, you have both National Sunday Law and Worldwide Sunday Law. But after July 18, 2024, we need to be looking, like I just said, for the arrival of a new message, because the test at Sunday Law is also a Boston. Now, we know that points and periods are relevant. However, in order for there to be a period, there has to be a starting point. And I think that July 18, we have a starting point, 2024. The RNC showed the complete takeover of the Republican Party. We saw patriarchy. We saw hyperbolic machismo, exaggerated masculinity. We saw gender inequality and sexism. It was on show, full display. The RNC showed exactly what culture would be in power when they were taking over the government. And at this point in time, the fourth and the fifth wave of feminism has really failed. It's not going anywhere. So we're starting to witness the result and the ultimate consequence of patriarchy when it takes control. And as I've written down here, we're witnessing the beginning of the end of the great controversy. And just to finish, I've actually reached the end, but I wanted to read these quotes from Luke. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. When they now shoot forth, ye see and know of your own selves that summer is now nigh at hand. So likewise ye, when ye see these things come to pass, know ye that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. So that is my presentation for this morning, and hopefully it's given a broad overview of looking at our last dispensation to, in my case, I believe, help to recognise the point where the Sunday law started, or that Sunday law period started, and the significance of being able to recognise that. So thank you. I'll just close in prayer. If you would like to kneel or bow your heads for me, thank you. Dear God in heaven, again, we thank you for the wonderful blessings that you have poured out upon your people. We thank you for your patience and long suffering, for the gentle hand overall that you've used to draw us forward, to help us to understand things that were so critical to, and are still critical to us understanding better, not just your government, but your character. We pray for each one of us in the movement here or around the world that you could please, on a personal level, help us to incorporate this character into our own hearts and minds, but also to understand it from a prophetic perspective, and to be able to see the significance and to remain on the narrow path as it's getting narrower as we're moving forward. And I just ask for a special blessing on everybody here. And again, we thank you for all your blessings. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.